All right, before we get right into things, I'm going to do a quick recap of the last video, because if you missed it, you might want to watch that first. This is a quick clip of the Ukrainian Nazi media calling for the extermination of the Russian people in eastern Ukraine.
Найголовніше, що треба зробити в даний момент, як це
No
там
matter how
жорстоко не
cruel it may
прозвучить,
sound,
є певна категорія людей, яких треба просто вбити.
there's a certain category of people that must be exterminated.
This is President Poroshenko, who was put in power by United States forces, most likely the CIA, possibly MI6, whose government was propped up by U.S. tax dollars, telling us how he really feels about the Russian people who are in the borders of Ukraine.
Тому що у нас робота буде, у них немає. У нас пенсії будуть, у них немає. У нас піклування під дітей, під людей, під пенсіонерів, під дітей буде, у них немає. У нас діти підуть до школи, до дитячих садків, у них вони будуть сидіти в підвалах. Бо вони нічого не вміють робити. І так, і саме так ми виграємо цю війну.
We will have jobs, they will not. We will have pensions, they will not. Our children will go to schools and kindergartens, theirs will hide in the basements and cellars. Think he was joking? That's Joe Biden's boy right there.
Here's some of your tax dollars at work.
Beautiful woman, isn't she? Look at how adorable that little girl is. We paid for this woman and her 10-month-old baby's death.
Here's the UN death statistics for the U.S. taxpayer-funded genocide of the Russian people in eastern Ukraine by Poroshenko and then later on by Zelensky.
But you can see there's been a constant, yes, it declined, but they live in a constant, perpetual state of war.
And U.S. taxpayer-funded bioweapons laboratories in Ukraine.
Does Ukraine have chemical or biological weapons?
Ukraine has biological research facilities.
Are the Ukrainians funding their own biological weapons programs? Their biological research programs? No, you are. It was thought wise by people in a Western political class to give these people a biological research program? Is this for when I tell you these people are stupid? Ladies and gentlemen, they are stupid.
And lastly, how the start of this conflict in Ukraine was begun when the Western Ukrainian military attacked the Donbas.
And we did say that if there was one thing that would prompt or goad the Russians into taking action, it would be an attack on Donbas and Lugansk. And around 4:35 in the morning, we got that. Throughout the whole evening, Alexander, things were really ticking up. The shelling, the artillery, rocket strikes, everything was really ticking up.
Yes.
And around 4:35 in the morning, the Donbas officials said, we need help. And, things were escalating to a dangerous level. And it looks like Russia said, okay, we're moving.
And now we'll continue where we left off.
Get on there and tell Lavrov he's going to be up on the War Crimes Tribunal. It's like, is she British? Does she remember what the Brits did in Africa and Asia and India? Well, a lot of those people still do. So it's just astounding to witness the degree of ignorance and incompetence and mythology and bad mythology, and but also just ideas. I mean, especially when you add, what were 60,000 troops doing next to the Donbas? I mean, why are they there such that they could be trapped? I mean, clearly they were. And why did they have more than 2,000 violations, according to the OSCE, the weekend before in shelling the Donbas? I mean, they already made it a shell of a country, a shell of a region anyway. Over the prior 8 years, 14,000 or so killed, mostly civilians, many of them children. British reporters didn't seem to care about those kids.
I'd like to point out here that when Russia did start its military operation, it marched straight from its border to Kiev unopposed. The Ukrainian army was not in a defensive position on the border with Russia. It was in an offensive position on the border with Donetsk and Luhansk. All right, so now we're going to get into our video today. I'm coming with an extremely counter-narrative position. But to start with, I have a question for you. Is there a single piece of evidence you have to support your current opinion of President Putin? Because if you don't have a reason to believe what you believe or think what you think, then you should rationally have a very open mind to new evidence.
He didn't do your typical Western propaganda thing, right? And it tells you something about Putin. The politically smart thing to have done would have been to have waited for the Donbas to be assaulted and attacked. Now, the consequence of that might have been that those people would have been wiped out that were still there by the time Russians could get in. The fact that he chose not to do that, it tells you something about what his mindset and mentality is, that he would rather that he doesn't care about the political cover for what he's going to do. He cares more about its political and military effectiveness in terms of protecting civilian life that is Russian by ancestry and political orientation. Indeed, if you look at where Russia occupies on the map so far, where they went in to dominate land-wise, it overlaps almost directly with Russian ancestry, with Russian language-speaking regions. You can go back to the 2004 Ukrainian election. And other than the region around Kiev, the rest of the areas where the Russian army has been able to easily enter corresponds to where the pro-Russian candidate, quote unquote, had the strongest support.
No, I will say that Robert Barnes has not said anything necessarily pro-Putin as far as his opinion of the man. He's only been giving information regarding what Putin does and his policies in government of Russia. I, however, will share my opinion, which is that from what I have seen of President Putin, he is probably a better president than anyone we've ever had. This is, of course, in striking contrast to the Ukrainian President Zelensky, who has handed out automatic weapons to civilians hoping they'll get murdered by the Russians on camera. Which resulted, actually, in the Ukrainian mafia taking those weapons and using them to kill each other in the streets.
I have some opinions about how the Ukrainian authorities have been handling the current situation, which I'm deeply troubled by many of the policies that they have implemented and some of the photographic evidence that I'm seeing of their policies insofar as defense of their country is concerned. However, there have been a lot of reports of indiscriminate shootings during the night and during the day from the people who got all of these weapons that the Ukrainian government issued to civilians. It seems very clear that many of the criminal elements in the country have taken these arms and they're settling scores or getting into little tiffs, and there's automatic fire in different areas of Kiev. Some 10,000 AK-47s were distributed to the general populace, and all you had to do was show your passport, and that was it. The government is forcibly conscripting all men between 18 and 60. Now, that is not the move of an army that is winning, or a government or a regime that is confident in victory. This is the attitude of a regime that wants to see civilians dead for the photo opportunity. The other thing that has been readily apparent is that the Ukrainian army or the political leadership or somebody is putting heavy weapons in areas that are heavily populated with civilians, making those areas a target. Now, if you park a couple of howitzers in the middle of an apartment complex, and I've seen such pictures, and they were verified, they are true pictures of what is going on right now. Well, those two howitzers, number one, the Russians are going to want to take them out. And number two, it is inevitable that they're not going to be able to hit them with pinpoint precision, because that's not the way war works. And because of that, a lot of civilians will be injured and killed. And so when somebody does this, an authority does this, the only conclusion I can draw is that they want to see civilian casualties so that they can score a PR win and potentially use this to emotionally blackmail the West into joining this fight with the Russians.
And so Ukraine is not the main point of this video, but I did want to mention just the stark contrast between the truth about who Zelensky is as a leader, which is that he cares nothing about his people. He's basically a war criminal. But the media is hailing him as some kind of hero. On the other hand, when you consider the way Putin started this conflict by sacrificing political gain to save civilian life, you see the difference between, I mean, basically, the people that the media praises are evil and the people that the media attack are good. This is exactly what you saw with President Trump versus President Biden. This is basically how the media always is. They're just lying, deceiving, evil people.
Especially when you realize that the Russian advance has consistently avoided targeting civilian infrastructure. Look at me now. I can prove to you that I'm in the middle of Ukraine, of Kiev. Okay, it's not just me making it up, and I'm talking to you on crystal clear communications. Why? Because the communication hasn't been knocked out. Cell phones, internet, water, sewage, electricity, they're all running perfectly fine, perfectly smoothly. The Russians could have taken them out in the first 5 minutes of this war. They didn't, because they don't want to harm the civilians. And the attitude of the invading Russian army is very clear that they do not want to harm civilians. And this is in stark contrast to the American way of fighting wars. Because the Americans, and they keep saying this, they say that the Russians are losing the war because they are not taking out essential infrastructure. But you see, the American way of war is to destroy everything and then walk in. That's not really combat. That's just destruction and then later rebuilding. But what the Russians are doing is very consciously making sure not to hurt civilians. They are ferociously attacking military targets, but they are going out of their way to make sure that they don't have civilian casualties. There are people fleeing. There are a lot of people fleeing, but it's not the mass exodus that you have seen in previous invasions like the Americans have done, whereby you have millions of people all of a sudden fleeing all at once because the Americans have destroyed everything. Sewage plants, electricity, forget about cell phones, and forget about internet. They've destroyed everything, which is not the way the Russians fight wars, or at least not the way the Russians are fighting this particular war.
That the unwillingness to accept that their interpretations of the Russian conflict or Russian-Ukrainian war were wrong is they're just not, they can't accept it. Instead, they have to spin ridiculous narratives about what's happening militarily in order to justify their underlying beliefs about what is happening in the conflict and, most importantly, the purpose of it. Because if Putin is going in and Russia is going in to take over Ukraine and use it as a staging ground to later go into other parts of Western Europe, then you do use a shock and awe type campaign. You do secure all the borders. You definitely secure the Polish border. You don't allow weapons to just continue to flood across that border. You do like what the U.S. has done in every war since World War II, which is you bomb the living hell out of everybody and everything. People have highlighted the fact that the U.S. military lost 10 times fewer people than the Russian military has at this stage in Iraq. The flip side of that is we also had killed 10 times more civilians than the Russians have at this time in Iraq, and that's using the UN's own data. And it's because they can't, in order to say that there never was a shock and awe campaign, that this isn't the Russian military strategy, was to concede that the political objective wasn't the one that they said it was. I mean, those of us who didn't think Putin would go in or Russia would go in was because their narrative was he was going in for the purpose of conquest, for the purpose of dominating Ukraine, for the purpose of rebuilding the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire. That was never true, and it's still not true. And the way he's gone in militarily proves that even further. He's going out of his way to avoid civilian casualties, even at the expense of Russian soldiers. I mean, you could save a lot of Russian lives if you just didn't try to go in and do almost, I think the way you described it, Alexander, is almost a quasi-police action using military is accurate. Now, that increases the risk to Russian lives. It's also going to make things go a little slower, but that conforms to what they want in order to make diplomacy effective. I mean, if you do like the EU and the West did, and you just do all your ammunition in the economic war at once, you don't have any place to go. There's no place to escalate. You've forfeited your diplomatic tools.
Exactly.
Your leverage has disappeared. Whereas if you go in slow and say, well, we'll go a little bit further unless you settle, and we'll go a little further unless you settle. That military diplomatic correspondence, it just can't work within the West narrative of Putin. It's like the whole disaster of a lot of this relates to the utter absence of strategic empathy being taught and being used as a skill set within the West diplomatic corps and intelligence analytical corps, But of course, you can't use strategic empathy if to do so would undermine your demonization and caricaturing someone else. You can't hate Putin if you come to understand him. And so you can't use this critical tool, which means you can't understand your purported adversary, which means you can't predict what he does will do, and you can't explain what he has done.
So, now that we've established that Putin is not trying to reestablish the USSR, which no reasonable person believes if they've read anything that Putin's written or listened to any of his speeches, because he is, for the last forever, been very critical of communism, not only as a system of government, but he's especially critical of the Bolsheviks because they chose to go after that idealistic worldview of turning the entire world into a communism utopia. He hates the fact that they chose to do that at the expense of the Russian people. He considers the USSR to be very anti-Russian. So basically, these people saying that Putin is trying to take over Ukraine to reestablish communism, they're nuts. They're completely fanatical, and they're just making shit up. It has no basis in reality. So, moving forward, what are the actual political goals that Russia is looking for? They've actually been completely open and transparent concerning these goals. Everyone knows them.
The guarantees that the Russian government wants, and Russia's spelled out these guarantees. I mean, they're very specific about it. Recognize Donetsk, Lugansk, recognize Crimea, denazify, and put in your constitution that you're putting your constitution that you will be neutral, codify.
Why do you think Putin is doing this? What is his end game?
Well, Vladimir Putin is carrying through on something that he's been warning us about, at least for the last 15 years, which is that he will not tolerate U.S. forces or their missiles on his borders, much as we would not tolerate Russian troops and missiles in Cuba. And we ignored him, and he finally acted. He was not going to allow Ukraine under any circumstances to join NATO.
All right, so now that we understand what their political objectives are, how does a war in Ukraine, at least the way that Russia is waging this war, how does that help them accomplish or give them a chance to accomplish this end?
Specifically been hammering this point home for a while, which is the fact that diplomacy and the military operation, the way it worked in Syria and the way it's working now, it's very much a dance. Sometimes the diplomacy is leading, sometimes the military operation is leading, but they're working together towards a common goal. And that is how the Russians have approached this conflict in much the same way they approached Syria. Now, we're not saying that Syria is exactly the same.
It was on the Rusi Forum, which is a sort of military forum connected to NATO, but the idea that the reason that the Russians haven't bombed Ukraine to pieces is because their air force isn't up to doing it. They don't have a big enough air force. I mean, this is fantasy. The reason they're not doing it is because they have taken a decision not to do it. Now, they've taken that decision because they have a political objective, and they see that political objective that taking that kind of step would contradict achieving that political objective. But of course, we don't want to accept that there is a political objective that's different from the one that we think. And we just don't understand that. And the other thing I think, which is important to say, and it's a point that it's embedded in your points, is that the Russians are doing diplomacy and war at one and the same time. Now, that's not what we've done in the West, well, for as far back as I can remember. We don't simultaneously fight and negotiate with someone. We don't attack Iraq, invade Iraq, and negotiate with Saddam Hussein at the same time, or do the same in Afghanistan. We didn't attack Afghanistan and at the same time sit down and talk with the Taliban's representatives. That's not what we do. Now, because we don't do that, that doesn't mean that others might not do that. And of course, that's exactly what the Russians are doing, because for them, much more perhaps than for us, war is indeed an extension of politics. It's politics by other means. It's diplomacy by other means. So you move into Ukraine, you put enormous pressure on the Ukrainian government, you make demands of that government, which it would never have made in peacetime. You change the frame of the discussion, and that's your political objective. And when you have people like Josep Borrell coming along and saying, well, it was a mistake to offer NATO membership to Ukraine. Well, he would never have said that a month ago. So you could see how, or even in that small way, taking this kind of step has achieved already particular outcomes. And by the way, on the point of casualties, one of the important things always to understand about Russians, the sort of Russian way of approaching things, is that they are prepared to accept losses in order to achieve their objectives, which we are not able to do.
Well, there you have it. To Russia, this is diplomacy by other means. Now, from their perspective, this is after 8 years of failed negotiations. This is after Ukraine surrendered to the Donbas in 2015, which was what the Minsk Accords was a surrender of Ukraine, which they then reneged on, backed by the United States. They've continually negotiated in bad faith for 8 years. Continued to shelling people that they supposedly agreed to have a ceasefire with. The Ukrainian government has been just absolutely horrible in their negotiations with Russia, and so has the West. The West has completely pretended that they did not agree to cease the expansion of NATO eastward 30 years ago, which we did when Russia decided to leave the USSR. You could go on and on and on, but basically Russia was getting nowhere in negotiations. We actually pulled out of negotiations before this conflict started anyway. As we were claiming on media that the Russians needed to negotiate, we actually pulled out. You can check that for yourself. Our Secretary of State canceled negotiations with Russia before the military operation began. The United States bombed Serbia and then took it over, made it a NATO country. I mean, the history in this region is very much... It just shows over and over and over how much the West and Ukraine have continually reneged on their agreements and refused to uphold their agreements with Russia and has refused diplomacy. So Russia is now basically using diplomacy at gunpoint to get what they need and get what they want, which frankly is a very viable method of diplomacy. Governments have to sometimes wage war to get what they want. We did that in America when we wanted our independence. And when we wanted to free slavery, we needed to do it again. So don't tell me that warfare is never warranted, because our country proves that warfare is sometimes necessary. As one of my favorite movies says, there is a peace that is only on the other side of war. All right, now to finish this up, I'm going to add some clips about Putin's accomplishments in Russia to help everyone understand the kind of man he is and why the Russian people support him as much as they do.
Right? So you're accusing him of stealing elections. Was it a couple years ago, over 2 years ago now, when they did that, and I polled Russia. I'm not exactly a Russian pollster. The guy was 76%. The approval rating was 76%. He didn't have to steal an election. There would be no reason. All right. Putin has never ordered the army to surround the capital after an election for him. You know, like he never fenced out protesters like Joe Biden did. Right. Currently, Joe Biden has more political prisoners in the DC jail than Putin has. I mean, that's just the reality.
And it's his currency. He wants the election to be seen as legitimate because he wants he wants it to actually be legitimate because he wants them to know how popular he is, because that's his leverage on everybody else in Russia. I'm the guy that has he's the only one with more than 50% personal likability in Russia of all the public officials in Russia. And there's a reason as well about to display monopoly on crime. So the state does. But that means the ordinary crime rate, it's very hard to commit crime because everybody's equal. So how do you show up with a new TV? you know what I mean? And everybody's a spy in your building. So, crime is hard to do. The Russian mafia existed, but they were heavily suppressed and mostly dealt in the black market economy in the 70s and 80s. not in the kind of crime that impacts ordinary people. So not assaults, not burglaries, not robberies, not things like that. But in the 90s, you can see 1990 crime rate, 15 per 100,000 people, thereabouts. It skyrockets to over 30, and it would go back up and then back up again. And then when Putin comes in and starts to stabilize things he comes in 1999, and slowly but surely crime drops, and then it stayed down. And now, as you can tell, it's at a lower rate than it was at the end of the Soviet Union even. And he's kept it at a lower rate than since the end of the Soviet Union. So he's reduced it by more than 2/3, almost a 70% reduction in crime that he's been able to sustain for more than a decade and a half. And that gives you an idea. That's one of the key reasons why Russians love Putin.
Yeah, and here is that inflation rate. Are you ready? Check this out, folks.
Exactly. And
I mean,
extraordinary
really,
through that process.
It was going back up too.
They were getting brutalized, and then he gets it all the way down and stabilizes it. And you see that little spike? That little spike should have been much higher, because that's when the economy collapsed and the ruble fell by 75%. And we'll get to some other data about how the real inflation rate is even lower for the ordinary Russian, and why this economic war on Russia will not likely impact the everyday budget of the ordinary Russian, even if the ruble collapses as bad as it did in 1998, because it collapsed badly in 1998, and yet he got it stable very quickly. There's a reason why for the real rate amongst ordinary Russians will be even less, and we'll get to the charts that point to that. And it's one of the big mistakes. What they're really doing is they're preventing the Russian rich from getting their Mercedes and Gucci handbags. It's high-end clothing, high-end cars, high-end luxury goods, French wines. Those are the things that are imported as consumer goods in Russia. There's some machinery and there's some chips and there's some things, but they've been working to replace a lot of that.
But look, speaking of budgets, here's the Russian debt to GDP ratio, and then we'll get into some of those PDFs, which really show you too how it's just when we show this stuff to you, think about like the presuppositions of their arguments, ladies and gentlemen. Because really, that's what we're going at here. The foundations of the foundational beliefs and presuppositions they're making, the arguments collapse when you realize they're incorrect. So
the data
no
rebuts them. There's a reason why you're not seeing a lot of data from all this propaganda.
Yeah, where are they?
Because the
Where
data. Exactly. The data. The other thing is, if you're a conservative, the way Putin has managed Russia is how you would like the United States to be managed.
I was just going to, you should actually
lots
be
of
jealous.
balanced budgets, safe reserves. Yeah, look at here's the debt to government debt as a percentage of their GDP. Again, 1998. That's about when Putin comes into power. 1999. Look at how dramatically he reduces it and keeps it low all the way through. And that this happens no matter what hiccups. Even when he gets sanctioned heavy in 2014 and 2015, he keeps it low all the way through. This is why they're like, Russians won't be able to pay certain debts, so on and so forth. Their external debt is far less than their internal reserves, so that they're not at risk. Unlike the United States economy, unlike a lot of Western economies, he has avoided debt. He understood he's an oil economy, so oil prices are going to go up and down. So what he did when oil prices are high, he stuck in surpluses. He didn't do what Venezuela did, which was spend it all, so that when oil went down, they were screwed. He was smart. He stockpiled it as reserves, stockpiled it as reserves. And a lot of those reserves, gold. One of the biggest buyers of gold the last 10 years, dear Vlad. This is why he's in those reserves that they put sanctions on. Most of those reserves he wasn't dumb enough to have those sitting in the Fed. He didn't have those in the EU banks. During the Soviet Union, there wasn't really poverty in a traditional sense, in the sense that what communism did well, quote unquote, is that everybody was equally barely enough to survive. But you didn't have homelessness, you didn't have starvation post-Stalin, etc. So, and then the reason why that context is important is they're used to low poverty. They're used to their basic needs being met, not necessarily in a happy way, but they're not starving. They're not without a home. They're not without heat, so on and so forth. Now, what happens is you can see it even gets so bad. It's almost 50%. at the time Putin comes in. And amongst certain working class communities, it was over 50%.
Yeah,
if you were
they
rural,
were devastated.
if you were small town, if you were elderly. And this is why when Putin came in, the biggest alternative to Putin, still the biggest alternative to Putin to this day, but it's small, much smaller. It's about half the size it was when he came in. What the Communist Party was about to get elected in 1999. Because a lot of the older folks were like, screw this. You know,
we need to go back. Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
And Putin was like, just give me a chance. And as you can see, every single year, down, poverty rate default until it gets around 5%, and it's now below that. And he's kept it there steady no matter what happens. Global financial crisis happens, poverty stays low. Sanctions from Georgia, sanctions on Ukraine, poverty stays low. It doesn't. It's irrelevant what's happening in the rest of the world. He structured the economy and society. And this is why there are people, particularly the elderly, will swear by Putin no matter what till the day they die. I mean, it got so bad you had Russian generals trying to sell nuclear submarines to Colombian drug cartel.
Right. I can't believe you knew that.
I mean, the guy went over there and they just wanted a sub.
Attack
and they're like,
helicopters.
Hey, you want one with nukes on it? You can take that. Yeah, can you imagine if Pablo in his war in Colombia had a couple of nuclear subs to go with him?
And
I mean,
by the way,
the
broker of that deal was a crazy Ukrainian from Kiev.
Yeah. Yes, you're right. He wasn't crazy. Exactly.
He was,
exactly.
man. And he
all
came to
back. Ukraine has been the center of grift. It's been the center of a lot of things over the last 20 years. Oh, yeah, this is yes. I mean,
military spending.
Yeah, military spending. So it was a very high percentage, but you can see by the end of the 90s, they'd achieved much of what they wanted, and particularly in terms of real spending. That you were talking about $6 billion. Basically Russia's military was gone. It was devastated, and in my view, very dangerously so for the rest of the world.
Destabilizing. Very.
The neocons and the neoliberals saw the Russian bear as a threat, so they wanted to sort of kill it, and they were succeeding at killing it to a certain point. I mean, you're down to $5-6 billion being spent a year. That's not a serious military. That's a military that is going to sell nuclear subs to Colombian cartels.
Yeah, because they're not making their payroll, Robert. They weren't.
Exactly, but very much like Reagan in the 80s, Putin understood the twofold importance of defense spending. First was just to be able to have secure borders and have hard power capability. But the second was it builds up your domestic economy. You build up technology. You give people good jobs. This was the part of the brilliance of Reagan in 80. That a lot of good white collar jobs, a lot of good blue collar jobs were in the defense industry. Some of the best paying jobs were in the defense industry. Building up the defense industry would have, and this has been a long debate between different people on my side and the left. The left has always seen defense spending as just net negative, as for weapons you can never use and shouldn't ever use. But what they have failed to appreciate is the collateral. I mean, many of our best developments in technology have been spin-offs from military developments. So if you understand
without a doubt, Raytheon came up with the microwave, my friend.
And you see it. And because men commit suicide at a higher rates, you see the drop is even more dramatic amongst men. It goes from almost a rate of almost 100 per, I think it's per 1,000 or maybe 10,000. But it's as soon as he comes in, which is right at 2,000, again, it's just steady declines, and to where it's almost more than half. And how does that happen? Well, and this is a good indicator because suicide rates tell you the psychology of the community and the people, the sense of pride, the sense of future, the sense of goals, the sense of satisfaction, the sense of identification.
Yeah.
All of these
health and well-being, well-being.
It's a very good metric for that. And it's just another area where the data shows Russian people much happier, much better off by their own definition, by objective definitions, in dramatic, extraordinary ways under Putin.
And if you have,
here's somebody who
understands
understands
basic needs met, Robert. If you have your basic needs met, and we'll go over that in a second, then that helps quite a bit, and especially when you're getting into these little global fights. But go ahead.
Here's somebody who understands the importance of self-sufficiency. So since 2000, they were already mostly self-sufficient, but there were major pockets where they were importing major key foodstuffs when Putin took over. Not now. And one of the key reasons is look at that 7-fold increase in organic agricultural land growth and it was not organic foods necessarily. It means organic as in natural land growth for farming purposes in Russia in just the last 10 years. He's been building for their economy and society to be self-sufficient, for them not to be dependent on foreign bankers, for them not to be dependent on the IMF or the World Bank or foreign governments, for them not to be dependent on outsiders. And that's part of the economic data that shows how he went about doing so.
The more reliable Western-sided pollster in Ukraine before this conflict started had identification split almost down the middle in Ukraine. 52% of Ukrainians wanted to identify with the West and ally with the West. 48% wanted to identify as Russian or Pan-Slavic and side more with Russia. Given the way that country is geographically and who is easier to reach and who is not, I think it's pretty safe to say that it's possible that Ukraine is majority pro-Slavic, pro-Russia. The presidency that we overthrew in the color revolution in 2014 was a pro-Russian democratically elected president. Petro Poroshenko was a CIA plant. The portion of respondents, or the percentage really of respondents, holding, quote, the U.S. and other NATO countries are responsible for heightened tensions in eastern Ukraine, rose from 50% in November to 60% in the third week of February. Meanwhile, Putin's approval rating grew by 8 percentage points from 63 in November to 71 in February.
The old oligarchy is gone, left Russia, and as long as they kept their head down and didn't keep stealing, they got to keep what they got in the rest. A few of them decided to try to stick their head up with some Western backing, and they got an uninvited vacation to Siberia for a couple of years. So the new oligarchy is all been created by Putin. And Putin's quid pro quo was, I'll make you rich. In exchange, you make the state powerful. You make our society powerful. You make Russians rich and powerful. It was kind of like, it would be if Trump was in Russia, Putin is Russia's Trump. And that's why they're all loyal to him. You can squeeze them all you want. He's been telling them, don't buy vacation homes in Paris. Don't have your yachts in Monaco. But if you want to do it, your business, but it's going to be at your risk. They are not in a position to take him out. They depend upon him for everything they have and ever will have.
Yeah.
But the
and
real
that's
basis,
the nonsense of it. That's the nonsense of it, Robert. That's somebody who doesn't know what they're talking about. Even pretend like they're going to take this guy out.
It's just ludicrous. But the other reason is Putin has been consistently for 20 years the most popular politician within his own country of anybody in the world. He has never dropped below 60% approval. It's currently at 71% job approval.
71. Yep.
And the reason we'll get into it, and we'll get into why, there's a reason why.
All right, that was a long cut. Special thanks to Richard Barris, who I did not ask for permission to make this from him, and Robert Barnes. They're great. This is from, that was all from What Are the Odds? I think episode 240 of the People's Pundit. Now, when I set out to understand the Ukraine-Russia thing that's going on, I wasn't going out to figure out like who's right and who's wrong. I just wanted to know from the American standpoint what standpoint we should take. And in all honesty, I did. I do sympathize with the Russians in this. I believe that they are right, that they are more justifiable in their actions than the United States, than Europe, or Ukraine. I think that the evidence for that is extremely clear, and I support mostly Donetsk and Luhansk, which out of everyone is the true victim in this conflict. But the main point of why I wanted to know the truth about what's going on is to understand what America should do in this conflict, and my conclusion is that we should not be involved. The fact that we are sanctioning Russia is stupid, it's illegal, and it's basically an open declaration of war against Russia for no reason and no purpose. And we should butt out of it. And ultimately, the reason why the media is lying to you is because they want you to think that it is your moral requirement to go to war with Russia, which is stupid and not true.
I have no problem being on the moral high ground because the side I'm on for realpolitik policies that avoid unnecessary international entanglements and wars is the position of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Andrew
Yeah, I'm
Jackson
good where I
and
am. That's
John
right.
Quincy, all of our founders. Whereas the position of being involved, the Ben Shapiro position, is on the side of George Soros, Hillary Clinton, Mitt Romney,
Woodrow
all the
Wilson,
neocons, the EU,
FDR.
Klaus Schwab. You know,
Yeah.
I'll take my side over that side any day of the week.